Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to survive the winter in the Middle Ages? Not the castles, not the kings, just survival. The kind that takes place under a roof made of straw, in a room that smells like wood smoke and damp wool. The kind where your blanket might weigh more than your hope. And warmth isn't a feeling, it's a memory. This isn't a tale of nights and feasts. This is the story of the people who didn't have tapestries, who slept beside animals, who counted the days not by calendars, but by how many fingers they still felt in the morning. Tonight, we're not stepping into history, we're sinking into it, into the frozen mud, the heavy air, and the quiet resilience of those who faced a world that offered no mercy and even fewer explanations. Because surviving a medieval winter wasn't about winning, it was about enduring, about outlasting the cold, the hunger, the silence, and then waking up to do it all over again. So, wrap yourself in something warm, make peace with the idea of discomfort, and prepare to discover how a medieval peasant made it through the coldest nights, and what it truly cost them to do so. You wake up, not because you're well rested or eager to seize the day, but because your face is numb. Your back feels like a sack of bricks left outside in a snowstorm, and your body has decided that sleeping any longer on a bed made of straw and frost is tantamount to suicide. The year is 1328. You don't know this, because no one told you, and you can't read the calendar that doesn't exist, but you know it's winter. Your nose told you first. Then your breath, which you can now see in the air, hovering over your lips like a ghost of better days. You are a peasant. You are not special. You will not be remembered. And the cold does not care about your dreams. Your house, if you can call it that, is a timber-framed, mud-walled, wind-loving, heat-hating shack with a thatched roof that has a PhD in leaking. There's no insulation, no chimney, no fireplace, unless you count the ash pile in the corner where yesterday's flame died of neglect. The door creaks from the wind's sarcastic knocking. The windows? There are none. Instead, there's a blessed absence of structural stability, where cold air negotiates freely with the warmth that used to be your breath. Your blanket is a slab of wool that hasn't been washed since the last crusade. You sleep fully clothed because undressing at night is a luxury reserved for people who have fireplaces and central heating, or at least an extra tunic. Your current outfit smells like a mixture of mildew, wet dog, and resignation. It has absorbed enough moisture from the air to develop its own personality. The only thing colder than your feet is your future. The straw beneath you crackles not with warmth, but with the brittle finality of a harvest long dead. There are bugs in your bed. There are probably bugs in your shirt. One of them bites you, but honestly, it's hard to tell because the sensation of pain has been replaced by the constant ache of existing. Outside, a rooster screams in protest, not to announce the dawn but to curse it, and you sympathize, because the sun, though technically rising, will bring no warmth today, or tomorrow, or probably until April. If you survive that long, the children are shivering beside you. One of them coughs. You pray. It's not the kind of cough that becomes a burial. You whisper a prayer, not because you're devout, but because superstition is the closest thing to healthcare you have. Somewhere nearby, a pig snores. It lives with you, not by choice, but because body heat is a communal asset. You rise, or more accurately, peel yourself from the straw like an old bandage. Your joints crack in protest. Your knees have filed for divorce. You stagger to your feet and nearly trip on the uneven dirt floor, which is now half frozen and half mud. There is no toilet. There is no basin. You spit into the corner and wipe your mouth with a sleeve that smells like fermented hay and regret. Your day has begun. It is 1328, and the medieval winter has opened its arms, not to embrace you, but to squeeze the last ounce of warmth out of your mortal body. You are not ready, but no one ever is. Wooden huts, rotting straw, and the generous term called home in medieval Europe The architecture of daily misery begins and ends with the word hut. A hut that would fail every conceivable modern building code in under 5 seconds. You don't own it. You don't rent it. You exist inside it until you die. And even that might not be a private affair. Picture this: a single-room structure made of timber frames, mud walls, and a roof generously thatched with straw, which doubles as both rain cover and rodent condominium. This is not insulation. This is an experiment in wind permeability. Your walls crack in the summer and mold in the winter. You live not beside your animals but with them, as in the cow is your roommate and the chickens are your alarm clock. The concept of personal space has yet to be invented. You sleep on a mat of hay, which smells like last month's beer, and has all the orthopedic support of a pile of damp leaves. Beneath you, dirt floor. Above you, leaky roof. Around you, a moist symphony of mildew, sweat, and that one chicken who refuses to shut up. This is your bedroom, your kitchen, your living room, and your morgue. There are no windows. Light comes from a hole in the wall and a fire that smokes more than it heats. And that fire? It's placed in the middle of the room, because who needs lungs anyway? Chimneys were a luxury, not yet mainstream. Smoke builds up, clings to the thatch, and deposits a lovely layer of soot over everything you own, including your lungs. It does, however, kill bugs, which is nice. You wake each morning to the sound of other people waking. Your family, your spouse's cousin, and a handful of lice. Privacy is a concept reserved for royalty. And heat? Only if your goat is in the mood to cuddle. In the hierarchy of warmth, humans are dead last. Your breath fogs the air inside your own home. You start fires not because you're cold, but because you're terrified of freezing to death. The air smells like wet wool and despair. If you're lucky, your hut doesn't collapse in a storm. If you're unlucky, you are the support beam. Rain seeps through the thatch, saturates the straw mattress, and welcomes in the mold that already pays rent. Insects? Constant. Mice? Friendly. Structural integrity? Optional. But this is home. A space not for comfort, but survival. Not a dwelling, but a shelter. And in the brutal logic of medieval Europe, a rotting hut shared with 6 humans and 3 goats was still better than nothing. Because at least it had a roof. Sort of. Sleeping with the entire family, including the ones with 6 legs. Privacy, in case you were wondering, did not exist. Not in practice, not in concept, not even in vague aspiration. In the medieval peasant household, bedtime was a group activity, whether you liked it or not. You didn't have a bedroom. You had a singular room, and that room was for everything. Sleeping, eating, praying, arguing, giving birth, and occasionally dying, all done on a bed of straw that had not been changed since your grandmother stopped bleeding. You didn't sleep in a bed alone. You didn't even sleep in a bed. You slept on a communal mat, or maybe a raised wooden platform if someone in your family had aspirations above their station. More likely, you shared the floor with your parents, siblings, cousins, perhaps a grandparent, maybe even a visiting pilgrim who refused to leave, and livestock. That's right, chickens, pigs, and goats weren't outside. They were right there next to you, because if you had a cow, it was worth more than you. Better keep it safe. The only thing separating you from a hen's beak was the occasional scrap of cloth and your own rapidly eroding dignity. And if you were dreaming of a cozy slumber, think again. The straw was full of things: ticks, mites, lice, and other arthropod freeloaders, with no sense of boundaries. Sleeping with 6-legged company was not an accident. It was an inevitability. You didn't get to choose your bedmates. You inherited them like family debt. Everyone was scratching, everyone was groaning, and everyone was pretending not to notice the rat that just sprinted over someone's face. Warmth came not from blankets, which were rare, but from the collective body heat of multiple humans and assorted animals crammed into a 10-foot radius. The result was a smell so specific it could be classified as a weapon. The concept of hygiene was still centuries away from being discovered, and bathing, if done at all, was more ceremonial than effective. So you laid there, between your snoring uncle and a farting sheep, trying not to inhale deeply. Babies cried, someone coughed blood into a rag, and your brother kept kicking you in his sleep because he'd caught something called medieval leg twitches, which is not a medical term, but probably should be. If you were lucky, the roof didn't leak that night. If you were really lucky, no one died in their sleep beside you, because removing a corpse from the middle of the communal sleeping pile was, frankly, disruptive. Sleeping in the Middle Ages was not restful. It was a nightly endurance test, and in this test, you never passed. You just survived till dawn and did it again. Welcome to bedtime in 1328, where the only thing more abundant than fleas was shared disappointment. Let us now address the thing you wrapped yourself in at night, that sad, scratchy relic known only as the blanket, though calling it that is already awarding it too much dignity. In medieval Europe, your blanket wasn't a seasonal choice. It was a permanent fixture, like the lice that lived in it. This was not a fluffy modern duvet with responsibly sourced feathers and hygienically approved layers of comfort. This was a slab of felted wool, stiffened over the years by sweat, filth, and something that might have once been broth. If you were lucky, it began its life as an actual blanket. If not, it was probably someone's old cloak, a sack repurposed from grain transport, or something a dying relative gave you with the whispered promise, "It's still warm." It was never washed. Not because people didn't want to, but because washing wool with medieval techniques usually meant boiling it until it shrank into a tortilla or disintegrated completely. Instead, your blanket absorbed everything: body oils, night sweats, the odor of your neighbor's goat, rainwater that seeped in from your hole-ridden roof. Generations of grime created a unique biome of crusty insulation, biologically hostile to most living things, except for mites, fleas, and the occasional beetle. By winter, it had gained mass. Not metaphorically, but literally. It became a weighted blanket by force of nature. You didn't wrap it around yourself so much as hide under it like a criminal from justice. Every morning peeling it off felt like breaking free from a damp cocoon of medieval despair. And yet, you kept it, because the alternative was death by exposure. Homes were not insulated. Fires burned low to preserve fuel. So you pulled that thick, damp rug over your head, inhaled its decades of must, and prayed your breath wouldn't condense into frost. The blanket may have made you itch, but it kept you alive. Sort of. Maybe. And thus, you clung to it, night after night, knowing that your ancestors had probably slept under the same one. A family heirloom passed down like trauma. And while today you might complain when your duvet cover bunches inside its sleeve, remember that in the 1300s, your blanket was both your shield and your sentence, your warmth and your warning. It did not comfort, it tolerated, and only barely. The hearth was technically the heart of the home, if by heart you mean a smoky pit of flickering embers surrounded by coughing humans and shivering livestock. Fire was life, and also a liability. Sparks could leap into dry thatch roofing faster than you could say, blazing inferno, and the lack of chimneys meant that smoke had no elegant exit. It lingered, always, a soft blanket of inhalable misery coating your lungs before breakfast. The walls turned black, so did your nostrils, so did your soul. Many medieval peasants suffered from what modern medicine might label chronic bronchitis. Back then, it was simply called normal breathing. If you were lucky, you had a hooded fireplace or a central hearth with a smoke hole in the roof. If you were unlucky, which statistically you were, the smoke just settled inside and slowly redefined your concept of visibility. The heat output? Minimal. A medieval fire was not an efficient furnace. It was a symbolic suggestion of warmth that barely radiated beyond a few feet. You didn't sit near it. You hovered over it like a moth, hoping not to ignite your one and only tunic. Nighttime was the worst. Fires were banked for safety and fuel conservation, which meant they were deliberately smothered. The fire stayed alive, but just barely, kind of like you. To survive the long, frozen nights, medieval people became heat economists. They slept in close piles, and no, not figuratively. A typical peasant bed was a communal straw-stuffed mattress laid directly on a dirt or stone floor, sometimes raised slightly on wooden boards if you were high-tier miserable. Parents, children, elders, and sometimes guests, all in the same bed, sharing breath and body heat like one tragic human radiator. It wasn't cozy. It was necessary. Babies didn't sleep in cradles. They slept tucked under an armpit, a surprisingly effective, if unflattering solution. If the toddler kicked, too bad. If someone snored, tough luck. If grandma died in the night, well, at least she went out warm. Blankets were rare and rarely clean. A heavy wool coverlet might exist, but its fibers were itchy, its scent was earthy, and its weight could dislocate a shoulder. Fur pelts were prized, but mostly by nobles. If you were peasant tier, your best shot at animal warmth was sleeping next to the animal. Chickens, pigs, goats, they all pulled their weight on team survival. And no, they didn't have names. You didn't name what you would eat by spring. Layering was also a form of strategy. You didn't undress for bed. You wore everything you owned, which in most cases was a tunic, and maybe a second one that qualified as fancy. The dirt embedded in your fabric acted as both insulation and regrettable exfoliant. And if your clothes were damp, which they usually were, thanks to leaky roofs and perpetual frostbite, you simply ignored it. The medieval solution to cold was less about comfort and more about stubborn, semi-conscious defiance. Sex, by the way, did not warm the room. Contrary to poetic imaginings, intimacy in a freezing wooden hut with 8 other people pretending to sleep 3 feet away was less romantic and more logistical. Privacy was non-existent. Soundproofing was theoretical. You didn't light candles for mood. You prayed you wouldn't get a splinter from the bedboard. Fuel was always a concern. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped and stored, preferably not damp, but beggars couldn't be flammable choosers. In many regions, even collecting dead wood from a lord's forest was illegal. Trespassers could be fined, whipped, or hanged. Yes, hanged, for picking up sticks. This led to the creative use of alternative fuels. Dried dung was a popular option. It didn't smell great. It didn't burn well, but it was free, and you were already living in an olfactory war zone anyway. There were no space heaters, no thermostats, no warm showers to retreat to. Cold was not a season. It was a condition of life. Winter didn't knock politely. It slammed the door open and sat on your chest until April. If you survived the night, congratulations. You'd get to do it all again. Every single night. Until spring thawed your socks, your pigs started giving birth again, or you died, whichever came first. The cold did not build character. It eroded cartilage. It cracked your lips. It froze your piss bucket. Every morning was a question mark. Every night a gauntlet. And all of it wrapped in the warm glow of mutual suffering and mild hypothermia. That, my friend, is how you warmed the medieval night. Not with comfort, not with romance, but with the quiet, unspoken knowledge that everyone else was freezing too. Shall we move on to what happened when you tried to eat? Spoiler, it wasn't pretty. You're hungry. This is not a poetic hunger, the kind where you browse your pantry and settle on a third helping of salted almonds. This is medieval hunger. A cold, gnawing emptiness that wakes you up in the night and reminds you that your stomach is more committed to survival than your soul. It's winter now, which means food is no longer a matter of preference. It is a matter of inventory, desperation, and hoping your neighbor died with something edible left behind. The growing season is over. The ground is frozen. Nothing grows. Nothing ripens. Nothing walks around fat and careless, unless it's a noble's pet or a hallucination brought on by vitamin deficiency. Let's talk food storage. Your entire winter diet depends on how successful the last harvest was. And by successful, we mean whether the rains came at the right time. whether the sun didn't abandon you, and whether the local baron didn't claim a third of your crop for taxes and tithes before you even had a chance to pretend you'd hidden some. Grain is your lifeline. If you're lucky, you have some rye or barley stashed in a wooden bin, covered with cloth, maybe sprinkled with ash to keep out bugs. Spoiler alert, the bugs come anyway. They don't pay rent. They don't respect boundaries. They're just better adapted to this life than you are. The bread you bake from that grain is not fluffy. It is not soft. It is not even fresh. It's brick-like, sour, and vaguely accusatory, as though it resents your teeth for attempting the impossible. It's not made daily. You don't have the firewood or energy for that. It's made in batches, hardened over time, and often dipped in beer or broth to soften it. That broth, by the way, is water with a few turnips floating in it. Maybe a bone, if someone in the village was generous or careless. Meat? You remember meat. Vaguely. It's for feast days and funerals. Mostly funerals. If you slaughtered a pig in the autumn, you cured the meat with salt. But salt is expensive, so you used just enough to preserve it in theory, not in practice. Every time you slice into that salted ham, you inspect it for mold. Then you eat it anyway, because mold won't kill you as fast as hunger will. Root vegetables are your friends now. Carrots, parsnips, onions, and turnips. Always turnips. As if nature decided that if you must suffer, it will at least provide something bland and durable to keep you company. Potatoes? Not yet. They don't exist in your European world. Beans and lentils might be part of your stash, but you ration them like gold. Cheese is rare, butter even rarer. Both are seasonal and go rancid fast unless you bury them in something disgusting, which, of course, people do. Eggs are unavailable. The chickens aren't laying. They're conserving their energy and trying not to die in the coop, which is colder than the outside world and filled with the existential despair of poultry. Milk is a fantasy. Your cow, if you have one, is dry. She's standing in a frostbitten barn wondering how she ended up here. You and her both. Fruit? You dried some in the autumn. Now it's shriveled, sour, and smells like regret. Apples turn to mush. Pears turn to mushier. Mush. Berries? Gone. Wine? Maybe. Beer? Definitely. It's the only thing you consume that's both safe and numbing. But alcohol doesn't fill you. It distracts you. Your stomach still roars. Your body still weakens. Your joints still ache. You dream of butter. You dream of roasted meat. You dream of anything that isn't a crust of moldy bread dipped in cabbage water while a rat watches from the rafters, judging your seasoning choices. And through it all, winter watches. It doesn't care that you planned ahead. It doesn't care that you salted, dried, and smoked. It's still coming for your food, for your strength, and for the parts of you that keep hoping next year might be better. Spoiler alert again. It won't be. Welcome to the medieval diet. Low in calories, high in fatalism. Welcome to your medieval home improvement nightmare. Imagine waking up in a box made of wood, mud, and regret. The walls are thin, not metaphorically, but physically, as in, you can hear your neighbor cough through them, and probably guess what they ate based on the echo. There's no insulation, because no one's invented it yet. And there's no incentive to invent it, because freezing to death was just part of the ambience. The walls are wattle and daub, a charming mixture of wooden sticks, animal dung, and mud. This delightful recipe is not known for its soundproofing, weather resistance, or architectural dignity. When the wind blows, and it always does, it doesn't politely knock. It barges in like it owns the place. You feel it in your bones before you hear it rattle the door. Speaking of the door, it's a slab of wood, unsealed, unpainted, occasionally attached to the hinges. It swings more like a suggestion than a barrier. And glass? That miracle of modern engineering? Unavailable. Windows are just holes. You might cover them with animal skin or maybe an old cloth, which helps about as much as whispering at a storm. Why didn't they build better houses? Why not stone? Why not thicker walls? Excellent questions. Here's the answer. Time, tools, and taxes. Stone was expensive. Transporting it was a nightmare, especially without wheels, roads, or the luxury of not being dirt poor. Thicker walls meant more materials, more labor, more cost. And no, you weren't keeping all your wages. You had a lord, and that lord had opinions about how much you owed him. Building codes didn't exist. If your hut collapsed in the wind, it was chalked up to divine will or poor character. Architects weren't designing for comfort. They were designing for, don't collapse immediately, and even that was optimistic. So the average peasant house was basically a glorified shed. One room, one roof, one draft. The wind didn't need to knock, .it was already inside. Every winter night, it reminded you that nature didn't care about your feelings. It whispered through the walls, curled under the door, and howled through the chimney like a banshee with abandonment issues. And you, wrapped in your one moldy blanket, could do nothing except pray, shiver, and wonder if reincarnation might eventually offer central heating. But no, you didn't build thicker walls, because you weren't building to last. You were building to survive. Barely. Welcome to medieval insulation, where the only thing between you and the frost is hope, and maybe a cow if you're lucky. You're cold. Not poetically cold, not hot cocoa weather cold. You're medieval cold, which is the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It moves in, settles in your bones, and starts charging rent. You wake up coughing. Not because you're allergic to hay, rats, or mold, but because your immune system has just thrown in the towel. Congratulations. You've caught what they called a chill, which, back then, was less of a minor inconvenience and more of a prelude to death. Let's start with the basics. The common cold in the 14th century? Not common, not understood, and absolutely not treatable. People didn't believe in germs. Germs hadn't been invented yet. What they did believe in was bad air, divine punishment, and the four humours. You, right now, have too much phlegm. That's your diagnosis. The solution? Probably a laxative, or a poultice made of warm dung and sage, or bleeding, because nothing says healing like draining the life out of you. But the cold never comes alone. It brings friends. Congestion turns into pneumonia. That tickle in your throat? Welcome to whooping cough. Fever? Maybe it's just the flu. Or maybe it's typhus. Or maybe it's the beginning of a 6-month, slow-motion descent into bronchitis, collapse, and finally, a shallow grave under a pile of rocks, because the ground's too frozen to dig. And all of this because you don't have a chimney. You cook over an open fire in the middle of your hut. Smoke curls around your lungs like an affectionate ghost. There's no ventilation. You breathe in everything. Wood smoke, cow breath, your uncle's snoring, and the wet cough of your cousin who's been not quite right since October. It's a respiratory cocktail. Blankets? You've got one. It's damp. You've never washed it, and you never will. Beds? Straw and fleas. Every night is an invitation to hypothermia, pneumonia, or some creatively medieval combination of both. And yet, life goes on. You still go outside. You still work the frozen ground with your hands wrapped in rags. Because if you don't, you starve. There are no sick days, no tissues, no hot tea with honey. You get up, you cough up blood, and you keep digging. And if you die, that's one less mouth to feed. The cold doesn't kill you instantly. That would be merciful. Instead, it erodes you, bit by bit, cough by cough. You don't even notice it happening until it's too late. Until your joints are always sore, your breath always short, your vision a little blurrier than it was last year. But you don't complain. No one does. Because everyone else is sick too. The only difference is how long they can pretend not to be. This isn't a chapter in a health book. It's your life. And it ends in a wheeze. Welcome to the medieval winter. Bundle up. If you can find something that doesn't already have lice. You stink. But so does everyone else, so it cancels out. Congratulations, you've officially entered the olfactory dead zone of medieval winter. You haven't bathed in weeks, maybe months. And no, it's not because you're lazy. It's because bathing in the cold season was considered, quite rationally, a flirtation with death. In theory, the idea of washing might sound appealing after weeks of sweating through wool, huddling next to animals, and layering grease over grime like sedimentary rock. But here's the catch. There's no hot running water, no fluffy towel, and no warm room waiting for you afterward. There's only the icy splash of freezing water hauled in buckets from a stream that may or may not contain bits of dead squirrel. And the moment your bare skin meets the winter air, your soul tries to flee your body out of sheer shock. The science of the time, and by science we mean guesswork, seasoned with theology, warned that opening your pores during winter was like inviting death through your skin. A warm bath was said to weaken the body's natural defenses and allow illness to crawl inside. And given the results, they weren't exactly wrong. Imagine bathing, catching a chill, developing a fever, then dying 3 days later while someone mutters that maybe you shouldn't have tempted fate with soap. If you absolutely had to wash, you did it in sections. A wet rag to the face, maybe the armpits if you were feeling ambitious. Feet, rarely. Whole body? Never. You didn't strip down and soak unless it was a holy day or you were on death's doorstep anyway. Communal bathhouses did exist, but most were shut down by the church during colder months, not because of the cold, but because they had a reputation for turning into something between a spa and a scandal. Winter made that decision easier. Stripping naked to sit in lukewarm water with 6 other shivering peasants wasn't exactly appealing when the wind outside could slice through bone. So you stayed dirty. Everyone did. Your skin grew its own layer of protection, a mixture of oil, soot, and something resembling wax. Your clothes absorbed it. So did your bedding, your straw mattress, and eventually your goat. It was a shared musk, a communal scent that bonded the village more effectively than prayer. You didn't notice the smell because the air was thick with smoke, livestock, and desperation. Your scalp itched constantly. Lice weren't visitors. They were roommates. You scratched behind your ears with a piece of wood. You found things living in your shirt seams. You accepted it. And if someone did dare to wash fully, you didn't admire them. You avoided them. Cleanliness in winter was suspicious, almost heretical. But if you think this is just a hygiene issue, think again. Bathing wasn't just risky.it was logistically absurd. You had to heat water over a fire that barely warmed the room. You needed a tub that didn't leak. You needed privacy in a one-room hut, shared with your entire extended family and a pig. And you needed time. Time you didn't have. Because every moment not spent hauling, chopping, or praying was a luxury you couldn't afford. So you let the filth pile on. Dirt became your armor. Grease insulated your pores. And, in a twisted way, you were right to let it. Because the moment you decided to purify yourself, the cold saw an opening, and the cold never missed. Medieval winter didn't punish the weak. It punished the clean. It's midnight. Your nose is numb. Your toes have stopped sending signals. Your breath hangs in the air like a fading ghost. And there's nothing remotely modern in reach. No central heating. No electric blanket. No fireplace crackling romantically like in a Christmas movie. Just cold. Relentless, invasive, all-consuming cold. So how did medieval peasants fight it? Not well, but creatively. Welcome to the world of desperation-driven heating methods, where anything that radiated warmth for more than 10 seconds could be considered a viable survival tool. Exhibit A. A rock. A perfectly ordinary rock, heated in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and shoved under the blanket like a medieval hot water bottle. It didn't stay warm long, maybe 20 minutes if you were lucky. After that, it was just a cold lump in your bed, and sometimes, if wrapped poorly, a burn waiting to happen. But it was better than nothing, and nothing was the usual temperature. Then there's the brick. Yes, the humble brick. If you were slightly better off, you had one specifically for warming. You stuck it in the ashes of the hearth, waited until it glowed like regret, then used tongs to haul it into bed. It was heavy. It smelled like soot. It occasionally lit things on fire. but it was loyal, until it cooled off and betrayed you like everything else. Now let's talk about iron. Specifically, the bed warmer. A metal pan filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets to preheat your sleeping area. Romantic in theory. In practice, a smouldering tray of embers under a flammable blanket in a wooden house. Many didn't die from cold. They died from trying not to. But the most bizarre and oddly effective heat source wasn't mineral or metal. It was biological. Enter the chicken. Yes, the living, feathered, slightly confused barnyard chicken. On particularly brutal nights, peasants brought animals indoors, not just to protect them from the cold, but to absorb their body heat. A chicken produces roughly 10 watts of body heat. Not much, but in a one-room hovel, every watt counts. They nested at the foot of the bed, clucked softly, sometimes laid an egg out of sheer stress, and radiated just enough warmth to keep your feet above frostbite. If you were really desperate, and most were, you hugged it. A living chicken. For warmth. No one judged you. They were probably doing the same thing. Bigger families had bigger animals. A goat in the corner. A dog under the bed. A pig near the fire if you had one. The idea was simple. Warm blood meant thermal energy, and medieval houses were glorified wind tunnels. You couldn't afford insulation, but you could trap livestock heat like a sad, low-tech sauna. The downside? The smell, and the parasites, and the noise. You didn't sleep peacefully. You slept surrounded by snoring relatives and barnyard ambience. But you survived. Barely. Clothing wasn't much help. Wool layers insulated poorly when damp, and they were always damp. Scarves were often strips of old linen. Mittens, if you had them, were fingerless or missing altogether. Some wore sacks on their feet. Others tied straw around their calves. In Germany, there were cases of peasants lining their boots with moss or sheep dung. Not for comfort, for warmth. It worked, but it smelled like despair. And then there was the human solution. Body heat. People slept close. Not out of love, but out of thermodynamics. Children slept with parents. Cousins spooned cousins. No one asked questions. It was the rule of heat conservation. You slept packed like laundry in a basket. Half asleep, half frozen, 100% uncomfortable. So the next time you complain that your heated blanket doesn't reach your feet, remember this. Your medieval counterpart was spooning a chicken, curled around a rock, while his sister snored into his ear, and a goat sneezed on his blanket, and he still woke up colder than you've ever been, because medieval warmth wasn't comfort, it was compromise, and survival wasn't clean. It was covered in feathers. You might think that childbirth is already difficult enough without needing seasonal hazards to make it worse, but in medieval Europe, giving birth in winter wasn't just a bad idea, it was borderline reckless. An annual gamble between life, death, and whether the midwife would even make it through the snow. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Heat. Or more accurately, the lack thereof. Peasant homes were rarely warmer than the outside air, unless the fire was roaring. But fuel was scarce and expensive. Wood was often wet. Smoke choked the room. And by the time the labor began, the house resembled less a place of healing and more a low-budget reenactment of the Ice Age. No insulation, no heating pads, just one or two half-frozen villagers trying to boil water in a cracked pot while your contractions echoed off the frosty walls. The straw mattress was damp. The sheets, if you had them, hadn't been cleaned since the last plague, and the only sterilization method involved prayer and an open flame. Midwives, those unsung heroines of medieval survival, faced winter deliveries with the same resigned dread as farmers facing a failed harvest. Roads were impassable, hands were numb. Light was scarce, and candles cost money. She would arrive hours late, red-cheeked, half frostbitten, carrying a satchel of outdated instruments and herbal guesses. And if she didn't show, congratulations. You were now both the patient and the practitioner. Remember, the nearest trained physician was 50 miles away, drunk, and believed you were bleeding because Saturn was out of alignment. Hygiene during childbirth? That's adorable. Water was icy and likely full of bacteria. Soap was a luxury. Most labor rooms doubled as kitchens, bedrooms, and livestock holding pens. You could be pushing out a baby next to a goat chewing cud. Infections weren't just common, they were expected. Postpartum fever, also known as childbed fever, was practically on the invitation list. And when it came, it didn't leave politely. Antibiotics didn't exist, and neither did germ theory. You either survived or didn't. Mostly didn't. And let's not forget the baby. Being born in winter was a great way to immediately experience disappointment. The air was frigid, the clothes were inadequate, and chances were you'd be wrapped in something resembling an old burlap sack. The crib was often a box filled with hay, placed disturbingly close to a fire that smoked more than it warmed. Infant mortality? Through the roof. A cold snap could end a life before it began. Now you might ask, why didn't people just plan better? The answer is, they didn't. Or rather, they couldn't. Contraception was somewhere between non-existent and forbidden. The rhythm method was more of a chaotic shuffle, and sex, though theoretically limited by church calendars, still happened, even when the ground was frozen solid and your breath fogged indoors. 9 months later, surprise, it's December, and you're in labor with nothing but a rusty knife, a wooden spoon, and divine hope. Of course, nobility had it marginally better. Castles offered stone walls and larger fires, though those walls also leaked cold like broken promises. And sometimes you had a real physician, whose best advice was to balance your humors by bleeding you mid-labor. Fun. For many women, giving birth in winter wasn't just painful. It was terminal. The combination of hypothermia, hemorrhage, and ignorance made it one of the most dangerous times to bring life into the world, but they did it anyway, year after year. In barns, huts, and manor halls, women endured, pushed, screamed, and often died trying to do what biology had assigned them without mercy or modern convenience. So the next time you think childbirth is tough now, imagine doing it in the dark, in the cold, while praying your midwife doesn't break her leg on the way to your door. Welcome to medieval winter, where life begins in frost and too often ends in silence. In theory, religion was the warm blanket of the Middle Ages, a comfort, a hope, a spiritual fire to thaw your shivering soul. In practice, it was more like a freezing sermon in a stone chapel at 6 a.m., with your nose half frozen and the priest shouting about sin while your stomach growled audibly in protest. Welcome to medieval winter piety, Rekis, a sacred tradition performed under the constant threat of frostbite. Let's begin with the church itself. Theoretically a house of God, realistically a stone refrigerator with acoustics suited for Gregorian chants and pneumonia. Churches were made of thick, uninsulated stone, which meant that once cold air got in, it settled in for the long haul. Sitting through Mass in January meant enduring the full liturgical hour in layers of damp wool while your toes slowly became strangers to sensation. There was no fire. Fire was for sinners, in hell, not for worshippers in the nave. Attendance wasn't optional. Skipping Mass because of a blizzard or a dying cow wasn't considered a valid excuse. God saw all. So did Father Bernard, and he took notes. Missing Mass could mark you as lazy, ungrateful, or even heretical. A dangerous label when bonfires and witch accusations were always in season, and so you went. Cold, tired, half-starved. You knelt on stone, made the sign of the cross with numb fingers, and tried not to pass out from hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The religious calendar, by the way, was not optimized for seasonal depression. Advent, Lent, and various saints' days often involved fasting. No meat, no fat, just bread, broth, and prayer. This meant that during the darkest months of the year, when your body screamed for calories and warmth, the church responded with ritual denial. It was character building, or character ending, depending on your blood sugar levels. The theology of the time didn't offer much comfort either. God was watching, always, and so were the saints, and the angels, and that one nosy monk who doubled as the village scribe. If your crops failed, it was probably because you had impure thoughts last Thursday. If your child died of fever, it was part of the divine plan, mysterious, brutal, and non-refundable. Repentance was the only insurance policy, and even that came with hidden fees. Confession, penance, public humiliation, and sometimes flagellation. Yes, that's right. People whipped themselves in public as a way to atone for sin, in the snow, barefoot, because spiritual suffering apparently required matching physical agony. And yet somehow, this system of sacred discomfort held people together. Religion explained the unexplainable. It gave meaning to the cold, the hunger, the grief. A baby dying in the night wasn't meaningless. It was a test of faith. A failed harvest wasn't just bad luck. It was God reminding you who's in charge. Religion turned misery into narrative. And narrative, when the world made no sense, was the only warmth many people had. Church bells still rang. Priests still preached. Candles flickered beside altars while storms howled outside. Villagers sang hymns with cracked lips and frozen lungs. They prayed not because they always believed it would work, but because not praying felt worse. It was tradition, discipline, and a way to feel less alone in a world that seemed designed to kill you slowly. So yes, medieval winter faith was many things. Cold, rigid, unforgiving, but it was also stubbornly human. A torch held up to the void, a whispered prayer in the frozen dark, and perhaps, just perhaps, the reason some people made it through it all. Every medieval village had two seasons, the working season and the dying season. Winter was the latter, a quiet purge sanctioned not by war but by cold. The truth no one wanted to say aloud, but everyone understood. Some of you just weren't going to make it. Not because you sinned, not because you were cursed, but because your roof leaked and your body was tired and the frost was faster. The records, when they exist, don't say much. They rarely named the dead unless they were landowners or clergy. For everyone else, the entry was usually a number. 3 souls perished this month. 7 buried near the frozen stream. A child lost. These were not obituaries. They were footnotes in the long, frozen ledger of survival. No mourning period, no tombstone, just a spot in the communal graveyard, and a name spoken one last time by someone who was trying to remember it. Children went first. Their bodies couldn't hold heat, and once the cough started, it rarely stopped. Parents would bundle them in rags, light an extra candle, pray to saints with names they barely remembered, and watch helplessly as breath slowed, then stopped. No doctor, no medicine, just time and a failing fire. If the mother cried too loudly, she was told to quiet down, not out of cruelty, but because grief too could invite illness. It was called melancholia, and it was considered contagious. The elderly followed next. Grandparents weren't cuddly wisdom keepers. They were labourers who'd run out of labour. Their hands no longer held tools. Their teeth no longer chewed bark-hard bread. Winter made them brittle. One bad fall, one fever, and they became burdens too heavy to carry. Some simply lay down and stopped getting up. Others were found frozen in doorways, having stepped outside to relieve themselves and not found the strength to come back. Then came the ones no one expected, the strong ones. The men who lifted sacks of grain like feathers. The women who bore 7 children and still hauled water in the dark. Sometimes, the cold just broke them. A lung infection that turned septic. A wound that wouldn't heal. A hunger that didn't show until the ribs did. They didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury. They just sat down near the hearth, closed their eyes, and never opened them again. Starvation didn't always look like an empty bowl. It looked like smaller portions, skipped meals, a family pretending they were full. It looked like mothers chewing food to soften it before feeding it to infants, then swallowing nothing themselves. It looked like a man going out to hunt, and never returning. Not because he was eaten by wolves, but because he knew the meat wouldn't be enough for everyone. Burial in winter was an ordeal. The ground was iron. The spade bounced off it like a toy. Sometimes the dead had to wait, wrapped in cloth, placed in a shed, or simply left in a snowbank. When the thaw came, they were buried quickly, before the smell set in. Crosses were rare, names were rarer. Memory, the most fragile tombstone of all, lasted until the last person who remembered them also died. No ballads were sung for these people. No sagas carved their stories into chapel stone. They are the quiet dead. The ones who made the mistake of being born at the wrong time, in the wrong class, with the wrong luck. Their lives were short, their deaths were silent, and their legacy is the dirt under someone else's plough. But here's the cruel beauty of it. Without them, no one else made it either. Every survivor stood on a hill of bones. Every new season was a sacrifice. The ones who didn't make it paid the price so others could say they did. And when next winter came, someone else would take their place. That's how the cycle worked. It wasn't fair. It wasn't noble. It was simply the system. And the system always wins. There comes a point in a medieval winter when the body stops protesting. It's not because the cold gets any less cruel. It's because your nervous system quietly waves the white flag, deciding that numbness is easier than agony. In the Middle Ages, cold wasn't an inconvenience. It wasn't even a season. It was the climate of your existence. And by climate, we mean the reason your fingers turned black, your joints locked up before 30, and your children learned the difference between frostbite and hypothermia before they could spell their own names. People didn't dress for winter. They just tried not to die from it. Layers, if you had them, were mismatched and stiff with age, sweat, and salt. Your outermost layer was probably an old wool tunic that hadn't been washed since the last famine, and underneath it, if you were lucky, a ragged linen shirt with holes in places you didn't talk about in church. Forget insulation. The wind knew your name and every entrance to your house. Walls were thin, floors were dirt, windows were holes. The thatched roof, your only defense against snow and rain, doubled as a nesting site for birds, rats, and mold. Fire? Yes, there was a fire, but let's not get too romantic. Firewood was expensive or illegal to gather if the land belonged to a noble, which it always did. Burning dung was an option. Less heat, more respiratory infections. So your hearth was more smoke than flame, and you mostly huddled around glowing embers like peasants reenacting a scene from Dante's Inferno. At night, you didn't sleep. You endured unconsciousness. Your straw mattress, riddled with bugs and sweat, absorbed the cold and gave it back to you like a passive-aggressive ghost. The blankets, if you had them, were made of rough wool, damp from breath, livestock, or both. They were never washed. Why? Because hauling water from a half-frozen stream, heating it over an open fire, and attempting to clean cloth, thicker than a bear, was not a task anyone signed up for voluntarily in sub-zero temperatures. Bathing was suicide. Sleeping alone was madness. So you slept beside your family, your goats, your lice, and occasionally a chicken. The upside? Shared body heat. The downside? Everything else. Snoring, coughing, the unmistakable scent of wet wool and humanity fermenting under one sagging roof. You didn't dream of better nights. You dreamed of not waking up frozen solid. Morning didn't come with birdsong. It came with pain. The type of pain that lives in your bones and has a personal vendetta against movement. You'd peel yourself out of the straw, joints creaking like ancient timber, and immediately be greeted by the type of cold that stabbed through your tunic like a dagger made of January. And then you went outside, because you had to. The animals needed feeding. The outhouse, or whatever passed for one, needed shoveling. The road to the market, or to your lord's fields, needed walking, regardless of whether it was paved in ice or regrets. And that's assuming you were healthy, which most weren't. Winter brought more than frost. It brought respiratory infections, chilblains, abscesses, and fevers that burned like fires you couldn't afford. Doctors weren't real, herbalists were distrusted, and the local priest was better at last rites than healing prayers. You sneezed, coughed, bled, and sometimes died, quietly, because everyone else was too cold to notice. Children were especially vulnerable. Babies born in December rarely saw spring. If you had 5 children, you expected to bury 2, maybe 3. If it was a particularly noble, sponsored winter, there was no comfort, just survival. And when you ran out of food, which you did, the cold became a kind of ironic mercy. It dulled hunger, slowed your thoughts, made you tired enough to lie down and never get up. The cold didn't kill you like a bandit. It killed you like an old friend who quietly turned out the lights. Over time, people stopped questioning it. Misery was inherited like land, except less useful. Cold became the wallpaper of your life. It wrapped around you. It defined you. And when summer came, you didn't rejoice. You braced for next winter. Because you knew it would return, just like death and taxes. And this time it might take someone you actually liked. The most tragic part? You didn't even call it cold anymore. You just called it Tuesday. In medieval Europe, warmth was a rumor. Cold was the truth. And you, like everyone else, learned not to fight it, but to fold yourself into it. Because resistance was futile. And anyway, you needed to save your strength for the real battle, making it through the next night, with your fingers still attached. At last, the snow begins to melt. Birds return, mud replaces ice, and you can technically see the ground again, though it looks more like the aftermath of a siege than a hopeful rebirth. Spring has arrived, but don't celebrate yet, because while nature is thawing, you are not. You, like the vast majority of medieval peasants, are emerging from winter not triumphant, but barely intact. You've lost weight, not the glamorous kind, the kind that makes your clothes hang off you like wet sails and leaves your joints so brittle you sound like a bag of kindling when you try to stand. Your skin is pale, not because you're ethereal, but because the sun hasn't touched your body in 4 months, and your vitamin D levels are somewhere between non-existent and medieval vampire. Your muscles have atrophied, your energy is gone, and the only thing that seems to grow with the spring thaw is your list of lingering infections. The cold is gone, yes, but it took things with it. Your neighbor's youngest daughter, your cousin who coughed all of January, that one pig you were hoping to keep for summer, your emotional resilience, all of it buried under frost and silence. Spring is not a celebration, it's a post-mortem. The house you spent the winter in smells like rot, mold, and regret. The thatch roof didn't survive the storms. There's a new leak where your bed is, and several support beams look more philosophical than structural. You can't afford repairs. You can't even afford a proper broom. So you move the wet straw around, pile it into the corners, and call it cleaning. Outside, your field looks like a battlefield. The furrows are flooded, the soil is sour, and the plough, if you still have one, needs more repairs than your body. You begin preparing for planting season with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for self-dentistry. Because here's the secret no one writes into songs about springtime rebirth. Everything you plant, you do so knowing that another winter is coming, that this cycle doesn't end, it just resets. Your tools are rusted, your ox died, your back gave out in December but never fully recovered. But you dig anyway, because starving in August is somehow worse than starving in February. The local priest declares the season a blessing. He says God has delivered you from the cold. You resist the urge to remind him he spent the last 3 months indoors, wrapped in fur, drinking wine, and quoting scripture about humility. You nod politely and go back to boiling moss. Food, if you can find it, is sprouting cautiously. A few leafy things, mostly bitter. You chew slowly, savoring the flavor of not dying. Bread is still hard, still mixed with sawdust, and still more dangerous to your dental health than a brick. But you eat it anyway. You drink weak ale and try not to think about your liver. The kids look better, slightly. The ones who survived winter now play in the mud with expressions that suggest they still believe in joy. You envy them, but you also envy the ones who didn't make it. Because survival in the Middle Ages was not a badge of honor. It was a sentence. You made it. Great. Now comes more labor, more taxes, more plague, more rules from people who don't even know your name. Congratulations. You've been promoted to suffer through the warm months. The nobles return to their castles. They pretend they suffered too. Their complaints include lukewarm wine and drafty corridors. You listen and say nothing. What would be the point? Your life is not a storybook. It's a shovel. You dig, you bleed, you pray, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you wake up again. You survived the winter, but parts of you didn't. Your optimism, your innocence, that part of your soul that once thought a warm fire and a good night's sleep were human rights, those are gone now, melted away like the snow, leaving behind only the soggy imprint of who you were before December. And now you have to keep going, because that's what survival means here. Not living, just continuing. Spring is here, and so are you. Barely. Prepare the fields, mend the roof, count your dead. And remember, in 6 months, winter returns, and this time, it might bring friends. You did it. You survived. Technically, you outlasted months of darkness, frostbite, starvation, and the constant psychological warfare that is sharing a single room with your extended family, a goat, and a bucket you all pretend isn't full of human waste. And now you stand, slightly hunched, probably infected, staring at the horizon as the frost recedes. The worst is over, except it's not, because surviving winter in the Middle Ages is not the same as triumphing over it. There is no reward ceremony, no cheering crowds, no heroic bard to write your tale. You don't level up. You don't unlock a bonus round. You just get to keep living. And the longer you live, the more medieval your life becomes. You don't get better. You just accumulate damage and then keep walking. What awaits you now is not peace or rest, but a seamless transition into the next form of suffering. Summer will bring its own delights. Sweat-drenched wool, sunburn through burlap, fields that never yield enough grain, and the annual tradition of watching your children play a game called Is That a Rash or the Plague? You'll keep toiling under the Lord who owns your land, your tools, and technically your bones. You'll keep paying taxes to a church that says suffering brings you closer to God. You'll keep nodding along when the priest says your life is blessed, even though you've buried 3 relatives this year and forgot what full lungs feel like. You'll keep planting and harvesting and hoping no one steals your only pig. This is not progress. This is just inertia with dirt under its nails. The truth is, surviving a medieval winter doesn't make you strong. It makes you available for more work, more rules, more aching joints, and unsanctioned tooth removals. It means you get to do it all again next year, only older and with fewer teeth. The concept of rest doesn't exist. Retirement is a myth. Joy is an irregular visitor, and death is punctual. You don't dream of a better life. You dream of a dry blanket, and maybe not stepping in something squishy when you wake up. And yet, for some reason, you persist. You wake up. You feed the animals. You patch the roof with your bare hands and half a prayer. You eat a crust of bread so hard it might qualify as a weapon. You hold your child close and hope they make it to adulthood, even though you know the math is against them. And when the sun sets, you lie back on a lumpy bed of straw and think, well, that was today. Surviving the medieval winter was never the end goal. It was just a checkpoint in an endless gauntlet. You don't get to feel victorious. You get to feel tired and itchy, and maybe slightly grateful that the roof didn't collapse during that last windstorm. But mostly, you feel small and fragile, and incredibly aware that nature, nobility, and God are in a 3-way competition to see which one can end you first. So yes, you survived, but to what end? To exist, to endure, to shuffle one more step forward into a history book that won't remember your name, to carve a life from frost and filth and famine. You lived through a medieval winter, and now you have the privilege of surviving everything else.